Hello and welcome to the Diaspora Today, where we focus on diaspora for development in Africa and engagement with Africans in the diaspora. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. On the show this week, we host the 19th Ghanaian ambassador to the United States, His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Bafo Ajay Barua, a dedicated public servant and distinguished statesman. Send us your view on diaspora issues. You are watching the Diaspora Today show. I am Abdul Rashid Abu Bakr. Thank you for making time out for the Diaspora Today show. His Excellency Dr. Bafo Ajay Barua, the ambassador.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. Yes, the Ghanaians' growing economic prosperity and political stability, further positioned Ghana as a regional power in West Africa. And Ghana is one of the countries that signed the AU's Continental Free Trade Agreement. What do you think about the position of Ghana?
Well, geographically, in the West African sub-region, we have a certain centrality, looking at the distribution of the countries in that corner of Africa. So that geographic position alone gives us a certain kind of impetus to try and lead the sub-region. But then also politically, in historical terms, we were the first to gain independence. We have tried very hard to lead a lot of the developments in Africa politically. And also economically, we have always tried to be more or less together for ourselves and also for the West African sub-region. So if we are seen to be a regional power, maybe the definition is accepted. And it is therefore incumbent on us as a country to ensure that the rest of the West African sub-region actually stays in with us, for us to have a common front, a common policy, a common objective to develop, the sub-region and extend it to the rest of the continent.
Ambassador, 11 countries are yet to sign the AU's Continental Free Trade Agreement. What is your take on this?
Well, I believe every country reserves a certain right to look at the details of the agreement and then sign. But I do believe that for all the countries on the continent, if only 11 are the standouts, I suspect that in course of time they will subscribe to it. Then mind you, even on the very elementary level, you may realize that especially in sub-Saharan Africa, for all those countries in there, nobody ever objects to being called an African. So there is that commonality of interest. There is that common thread which says that whatever the majority probably will subscribe to, the rest, will catch up because of the fact that we see a certain kind of common base for all of us. So I do believe that those who haven't signed does not indicate that they are objecting to the arrangements. I guess every country has peculiarities, and therefore they will need to examine the terms of the agreement as it suits them as individual countries. I'm sure in the final analysis, they will come into the fold.
and sign.
And sign, yeah.
For the first time in the history of Africa, the AU was able to bring African leaders to the table and sign this agreement. Also, we have the African here agreement. Do you think this is a way forward for African economy, integration into the global economy?
Well, it has to be a way forward, because somewhere along the line, part of the African problem has been with respect to the fact that we don't have any significant inter-African trade. And because we trade with countries that initially probably controlled most of us politically, we have never had the advantage of seeking our interest. In fact, when people talk about the rules of international trade, the norms of international arrangements and such, when these rules and norms were being set, we were never at the table. So now, coming together, we would be able to establish our common interest and basically argue for those common interests. So it certainly is a way forward, if only we are going to stick together. Because we have had times when we have even managed to parcel some kinds of mutually acceptable terms between us. But then we find other people sort of gnawing under these agreements and then eventually sort of having a difficulty holding the line together. But I'm very confident that this time Africa will see to protecting African interest and stick to the agreements as we have them. Of course, periodically we may need to review some of the terms. That one is natural. But I expect that in general terms, we are obviously going to be able to uphold the terms and the principles contained in the agreement that has been signed.
So tell me, is Ghana open for business?
We are more than open for business. Our president, for instance, has said that he is in a hurry to improve on the economy, in a hurry to improve on people's socio-economic situation, in a hurry to ensure that the economy, as it were, moves up and up. And because of that, and topping that, is the fact that the president says we would want Ghana to develop without aid. So if we are going to develop without aid, then obviously where we are going to be hitting is a relationship between Ghana and private enterprise. And as long as the understandings between Ghana and private capital are fair, obviously we are going to make it possible for anybody who comes to us to invest in our neighborhood to have a fair return on a fair investment. Obviously, what we are going to try to control is the kind of shyster investors who normally come basically to rape a country and go away. But this time, we just want to make sure that the arrangements are fair, the rules are fair, the terms are reasonable, and therefore either side would respect whatever the parameters are. So we are open for business. Everybody, is welcome, to come and invest with us. But the intentions ought to be correct, noble, economically defensible, and socially acceptable.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Sure.
What are the process, what are the plans that the government have in place to ensure that investors' investment are protected in Ghana?
Well, at the moment, Ghanaian laws are particularly good when it comes to protecting the individual's investment. For instance, we have, laws that say that, one, you can export your profits without any encumbrances at all. Two, the investment laws, in fact, the company laws ensure that one's, investment cannot be appropriated simply because the person happens not to be a Ghanaian. And then three, because we will continuously want to attract investors, we also make sure that those who are already in are comfortable, are very respectful on either side insofar as the laws and the regulations are concerned. And the courts are always open for anybody who has an umbrage to go to the courts for a determination to be made. So as far as investor interests are concerned, we make sure that we don't leave anybody hanging anywhere to dry. We will and we do protect investors.
Ambassador, in what ways can Africa leverage the power of Africans in the diaspora towards economic development?
Well, I do believe that Africans in the diaspora, even if they feel excessively comfortable wherever they are, even if they have developed a mentality that they are sort of no longer Africans, would always recognize that the rest of the globe would always see them as Africans. And therefore, whilst concentrating on where they are, they would always have to have a certain backdrop on where they came from. We have it in the language that there is no comfort watching your house burn whilst you sit on somebody's front porch. Because after the house is burned down, the owner of the front porch may well come and ask you, when are you going home? Knowing very well that there's no home to go to. And besides, in contemporary terms, if one is not careful or one is not lucky, or if there is a certain kind of excessive overturn of events, maybe somebody will come and ask us, or somebody is going to tell us, the way Caesar Augustus told everybody, go to your hometown and be counted. So we all have to go home and be counted. The chances then are that after you've been counted, and you would want to go back to where you used to be or what have you, somebody might tell you that, oh, the rules have changed, there is a wall, and therefore you cannot even climb over. So Africans in the diaspora would always have to recognize the fact that they have roots somewhere, and they need to protect the roots. And besides, Africa is their reference point. Africa is their root. Africa is their home. And therefore, whichever way they look at it, it is incumbent on each of us to make a contribution towards the development of Africa.
A lot of my fellow Africans in the diaspora believe that the doors have been shut on them. How do you open the door, Ambassador?
I'm not too sure as to how they interpret the door being opened on them, being closed on them. The fact of the matter is, some of them, wherever they are, cultures are different, standards are different, the way of doing things are different. And therefore, when they go back, to Africa, they transport with themselves, they transport what is it that they have been experienced over the years to the environment that they've entered, in Africa. The fact of the matter is the parameters are different. And therefore, if somebody, for instance, goes into any of the African capitals, and what they expect is that, down the line you walk into some shop and you can buy anything from a Mercedes-Benz to a gun. We don't have that kind of thing in Africa, because maybe the method of trade is different. And you see, where you are transposing different standards, you create difficulties for yourself by not being mindful of the changes in the general environment that you are in. If anybody seriously argued that the door is shut on them in Africa, I will find it very odd, because if anything at all, Africa as a general area, and most African countries, are even so very welcoming to foreigners that I can't see how they cannot be welcoming to their own kind. So I don't buy that argument, except that maybe some people go with attitudes which are probably unacceptable in the African context. You can't take a man out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the man. So somewhere inside all of us, there is always going to be a certain kind of attachment, a certain kind of loyalty to the area where your roots are. And I think maybe part of the difficulty that we have had as Africans relate to the fact that sometimes a good number of us forget that home is where your heart is. And home is where you go and they have to take you in. And for the average African, no matter where he or she comes from, in Africa, they will take you in, which doesn't happen in the other parts of the world, which are not necessarily African. So, yes, it is true that there is a certain kind of seepage of the African Jews in every African. And that is what ought to keep them going. And that is what should keep Africa on their minds. And that is what should keep them always looking at what is it that their contribution could be insofar as the development of the continent is concerned.
What advice do you have for Ghanaians in the diaspora?
Well, there is nobody who is going to develop Ghana for Ghanaians but the Ghanaians themselves. And those in the diaspora ought to consider it their duty. They ought to consider a part of their responsibility to make a contribution towards the development of the country. And that contribution may well come in terms of making, some kind of effort to support some of the activities going on in the country. And in fact, making an effort to invest in the country, insofar as the whole question of developmental projects are concerned. At the moment, I'm looking to setting up a private equity fund into which Ghanaians could invest. Now, with that kind of investment, we can use that money to develop the country, and at the same time, those who put their money in will be making a profit. In the same way that even those who are here and would want to engage in economic activity in the States could also tap into that kind of fund to develop whatever area of activity they would want to develop. So insofar as Ghanaians are concerned, I would want them to constantly recognize the fact that they are Ghanaians and they owe it to themselves and to their country to support their country to develop. They cannot, as it were, sit by somewhere and basically either moan because they don't see the country moving as it should, and they also have to take an interest in making contributions, whether it's mental or what have you, towards a certain package of effort to develop, the country. If the country is good, you yourself, you will be good and you will feel good. Because somewhere inside each one of us, there's a certain, twinge of pride that you get because you can see your country flying. And Ghana is bound to fly because we are probably one of the very few countries on this planet that have no reason to be poor. We have just managed not to manage well. But this time we are determined to manage well. And all the Ghanaians in the diaspora should make it their business to make a contribution to that change in attitude so that when the flower blooms, each one of us can stand by, look at the flowers and tell themselves that I was there when we were planting it.
To other Africans in the diaspora?
The Africans in the diaspora, insofar as their individual countries are concerned, can also have the same attitude. But then also, they ought to be able to come together somehow. because if there is that level of unity, they can control resources. They can help direct those countries that need direction. And besides, even within the countries where they live, they ought to come together, because the numbers and how the numbers are glued generate economic power, generates political power. Because there is absolutely, I find it difficult, for instance, to understand why in certain cities you would have about 30,000 people who are purely African, but they don't even hold a position as a dog catcher in the council. And 30,000 in anybody's calculation is a big number, politically very significant. And besides all that, even if you had one person in a legislature, that one person constitutes an effective lone voice, and therefore the larger community could benefit by having that lone voice in a legislature. I think Africans generally need to pull together so that their intrinsic interest could also be protected. I know, for instance, that there are lots of Africans who are very significant in terms of numbers and expertise in certain areas of economic activity and whatnot. They don't control any of those. But then if you look at some of the other peoples in a country like this, you go into certain areas of the economy, and you can bet your last dollar that it will be significantly influenced by people from that background. The Africans haven't done that, and I think they better start doing that, because that is what gives them a certain feel that even though they are not, say, native born, they certainly have a certain kind of clout because they have made more than significant contributions to the development of this country.
It's time for you, my viewers from all across the world, to wake up and say to yourself, I will take ownership of Africa. Once again, thank you, His Excellency Dr. Ajay Bawa. I really appreciate your time, and we'll continue to engage with you on issues of concern to Africa and Ghana as a regional power in West Africa, and other pressing issues that are affecting Africans in the diaspora and from all over the world. Thank you so much, my viewers from around the world. Till we catch again, my name is Abdul Rashid Abu Bakr. Have a wonderful day.
Began in 2017 when Dark Professional launched its first product called Sensation, a 5-star pain-free cordless trimmer that achieved immediate success. We have since then been working hard to extend our vision, and today we introduce to you 3 new, significantly advanced products: Signature, Superior, and Synergy. Be the first to explore our new advanced technological innovations made by us for you, simply by Dot.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, again, ladies and gentlemen, our friends from the media, young people from the diaspora and from far off, the lovely African continent. Once again, thank you very much. A very warm welcome to this very important summit. Just from the turnout here, I can see that we're going to have a very, very interesting, robust, exciting, informative, highly educative discussion. I introduced myself earlier. I'm going to do it again for the sake of our friends who've just joined us. My name is Maureen Nkandu, and I work for the African Union here in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to have you here, and as you can see, we've got beautiful weather, a bit of rain, but it does get sunny at times. So let's give ourselves all a very big hand for this wonderful turnout. Well, my remarks this morning, I'm going to be the program director, but I'm going to be very brief as well because there's robust discussion to be had. But what I want to say is, isn't it wonderful to see vibrant young men and women from different African countries in the same room with young women and women African women and men who live here in the United States, who are in the diaspora, getting together to tackle issues that have to do with issues around the continent. Isn't that just a wonderful experience? This summit has been put together in a very highly collaborative effort. As you know, the African Union, the Department of State here in the United States, and the US, the Chevron, of course, who are one of our big sponsors, Constituency for Africa, and the Africa Development Foundation. So many others also who've worked very hard to put this summit together. We'll get to hear them speak a little later. So what I want to do now, without much ado, is to introduce a very important person. He's important only because he's starting the session today, but he's also very important in so many other ways, and we'll get to know about that as we go along the rest of the day. And that is Melvin Foote, and Melvin is going to lead the first panel discussion. He's going to map out the details of how the discussion is going to be, which is going to set the trend on how we're going to manage the rest of the discussions today. I think that we'd all like it to be very engaging and very interactive because there's a lot to learn from this cross-fertilization of ideas. And definitely also to say that, we're also going to hear from guest speakers. But actually, before Melvin starts with the panel discussion, there's an important message also that we're going to have in this video message, which was recorded and sent to us all the way from Addis Ababa. And this message is a welcome message from, I just need to get my notes here. This is what happens when you have so many notes and you toss them all around and then suddenly you can't find the ones that you're looking for. So this video is a message from Her Excellency Mary Beth Leonard, who's the U.S. ambassador to the African Union in Addis Ababa. She sent us this video recording, so let's have a look.
Launched a number of years ago under President Obama, continued under President Trump as a high-value, important engagement with Africa, with emerging leaders of Africa.
I want to warmly welcome the Mandela Washington Fellows and the African Diaspora Leaders to the first ever African Diaspora Young Leaders Summit, also known as ADYL. ADYL offers a unique opportunity to foster partnerships between young leaders on the continent and the African diaspora in the United States.
I am Semandela Utoni. I am from Namibia.
I'm from Nigeria.
I'm John. I'm from Ethiopia.
I was selected as part of the team from the AU under the US AU mission.
Today, you are creating the relationships that will strengthen and deepen the U.S.-Africa partnership, a partnership that will shape the world's economy, well-being, and security for years to come. As the premier multilateral organization on the continent, the African Union is a natural partner to the United States to advance our common interests and goals. That's why the United States created a dedicated mission to the AU in 2006, becoming the first non-AU member state to do so. The United States mission to the African Union, also known as USAU, strengthens the strategic partnership between the United States and the African Union with the aim of supporting a stable and prosperous Africa.
I think the first thing that is really, really exciting for the fellowship is that it has been in existence for about 5-6 years now. So it has managed to develop this incredible network of young African leaders all over the continent, really doing incredible things.
I expect to meet more people, interact more with people, share my experiences, hopefully also meet people in the same background as I am.
The US-AU relationship is based on 4 areas of technical cooperation as outlined in our 2013 Memorandum of Understanding. The areas are democracy and governance, economic growth, peace and security, and finally, opportunity and development. The United States works closely with the African Union on a vast spectrum of programs and initiatives within each of those 4 areas. To take an example in the realm of health, the United States answered the African Union's call to fast-track the establishment of the Africa Center for Disease Control, also known as Africa CDC, by committing technical expertise to help the African Union establish a public health emergency surveillance and response mechanism. The Africa CDC has been successful in tracking and responding to disease outbreaks across the continent, including the most recent Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of our most important endeavors with Africa in the economic arena is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. AGOA has been the cornerstone of U.S. economic engagement with African countries since 2000, with some fairly significant gains in U.S. investment, job creation, and increased cross-trade flows. With almost 70% of Africans under 25 years of age, empowering young people is at the heart of U.S.-Africa relations, and there is no better example of America's commitment to helping develop the next generation of African leaders than the YALI program.
Beyond the professional development experience, I expect to get a lot of networks that would help me build on my experiences, what I intend to do when I come back to my country, and then contribute to the African Union and get the most out of the social experiences in the United States.
YALI aligns with African Union priorities of employment and entrepreneurship, education and skills development, health, well-being and rights, and governance. YALI has had great success in supporting the next generation of African leaders, and we are only just beginning to see how dramatically these young men and women will transform the face of the continent in the years to come. Having worked in Africa for most of my career, the Africa I have come to know is a continent of vast opportunity and promise. It is a continent with tremendous natural and human resources and a rapidly expanding middle class. Africa has made remarkable progress despite significant challenges. And when I think about eradicating poverty, countering and preventing violent extremism, and boosting economic growth and trade in Africa, young leaders, both on the continent and within the African diaspora, are central to the conversation. I hope your participation in ADYL today sparks the conversations, builds the skills, and creates the relationships needed to build a stronger U.S.-Africa partnership, not only to meet the challenges of Africa, but to take part in the opportunities represented by a growing U.S.-Africa relationship.
The American people need to know that their money is being used in the right way and that there is a multiplier effect to this program. Their money might be training 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people, but it's multiplying in millions. And I hope that this program can prove to the world that the youth can actually make a change, and a significant change in the way politics is done, in governance, in business, and in all other spheres of life.
Well, there you are. That's a very brief insight into U.S. and African Union cooperation, very educative as well, loaded with information and detail on various programs. Now, I'm going to call upon Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the African Union. She's the permanent representative of the African Union to the United States. But before I do that, I just want to announce for those of us, and I know most of us young people are very keen on social media, that we are video streaming this conference, this summit live on the AU website, which is auwashingtondc.org, and all you have to do is click on Watch Live. So if you can SMS and send text messages to as many people as possible to watch the proceedings. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us now give a very big hand to Her Excellency Ambassador Arikana Chihombori Kwao of the African Union.
Good morning, young people. Distinguished guests, members of the lovely Africa Bureau at the State Department, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me. My name is Ambassador Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao. In my previous life, I was a medical doctor before becoming an ambassador. I must say, standing in front of all of you brilliant young minds, I am walking 10 steps above the ground right now. But more importantly, I feel 10 years younger by simply being in your midst. It is quite refreshing to stand here and look at you all, the future of Africa. Now, let me start by saying, how did we end up here? Our story as Africans, in terms of our history and our politics, takes us back to 1884. That 1884, that was during the Berlin Conference, and I am so keen on making sure that each and every young African understands that day and that period from November 1884 to February 26, 1885, when our colonial masters met and designed a way to see to it that our continent was forever a defeated and dominated continent. Because quite often as I give my talks, people would say, but Ambassador, Berlin Conference was centuries ago. And my reply to them is, as long as we have a country called Togo, a country called Benin, a country called Rwanda, Burundi, and many other African countries. So you got to remember, why did they come to the Berlin Conference? They came to the Berlin Conference because they were getting ready to have a European war on the African soil. They were fighting each other over how to distribute the loot from the African people. You see, they found out about your wonderful, amazing continent with everything that the world needs. So the Germans rushed in. The French rushed in. The Spaniards. Even the Russians, the Belgians. And so after I have stolen your cows, here comes the French, they steal it from the Spaniards, and before you know it, they were fighting and killing each other. So the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, he called his friend Belgium, the president of Belgium, was it Napoleon? Leopold. They said, we're going to do something about this situation going on in Africa. Why don't we come together and figure out a way of looting from these people? But more importantly, let's come together and strategize on how to make sure that these people, these Africans, who they considered monkeys, are forever defeated and dominated. I need you to understand why the Berlin Conference was held. So they sat from November to February, all of them sitting around 14 countries, and across from them was this gigantic map of Africa. And they figured that on this side over here, we have tribes that get along too well. We got to do something about that. Let's chop them up. So France, you take this little section, and we'll call that section Togo. And then we come over here, we say, oh yeah, another little slice over here. Let's call it Ghana, give it to the British. Oh, let's come down over here. Let's cut out a little section and give it to Spain. It was all by design to see to it that the Africans were not only divided, but that they would never get along. Some of you know very well. You take a country like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Same people, same tribe. Malawi, there is a tribe that when they're having their ceremonies, their queen comes from Tanzania because they're the same people. The divisions were by design. So for those who tell you that the Berlin Conference was over 200 centuries ago and we shouldn't talk about it, as long as we have the African countries and the boundaries that we have today, the Berlin Conference is alive and well. And its mission to divide and conquer the African, to make the Africans a defeated and dominated people, is mission accomplished. The question then becomes, why has it taken us so long as Africans to wake up to that fact, to realize that those boundaries were designed to see to it that no individual African country can survive? It is all by design. Fast forward, 1964. Our Pan-African leaders got together and realized that the only way for Africa to survive is for Africa to come back together and eliminate those boundaries that are not ours. So they met and created OAU, Organization of African Unity. It was an effort to begin that journey to rebuild the Africa that we want. It was a meeting to begin to get the Africans to speak with one voice, one heart, one mind, one soul, proud and strong. 55 years later, we are yet to attain that perfect African Union. Why? Because Berlin Conference is alive and well. Because the rule of divide and conquer is alive and well. That seed was sown in 1884. And guess what? We, the children of Africa, are continuing to water it, to nurture it, and make sure that it thrives within us. And that is why we're here today. To begin that conversation that is so much needed. The conversation that only you and you alone can have with that image in the mirror. Who am I? Why do I think like I do? I'm going to take it home because quite often if I say, we're all colonized as Africans, and people say, oh, no, Ambassador, I'm not colonized. Well, you tell me why. I've taken many of my white brothers and sisters to Africa. I was working with another ambassador. 2 ambassadors. We're carrying our bags, and one of our assistants was my little daughter who happens to be white. The young people in Africa in the offices where we went, they were quick to want to grab her purse and ignore me and the other ambassador. Does that sound familiar? Why are you doing that? Because the Berlin Conference told you that you are inferior to your white brother and sister. It is just that simple. We may want to hide the obvious fact, but the reality is, as long as we black people feel inferior to our white brothers and sisters, how can we have a conversation? We got to realize that we're just as good as everybody else. This rule of divide and conquer must die. And the place where it needs to die is right here. So before they can tell you that your most wonderful, amazing continent, the mother of all continents, is a diseased and dying continent, I want you to stop. Because you are the origin of humanity. Life as we know it starts with you. Now, some might beg to differ, but fact is fact. Before they tell you that you are not as good enough, remind them that the blood that runs in you is the blood of originality. I would like to say we actually happen to hold the genome, the code for life as we know it. The original genome is in Africa, and it's in us. And why would we allow anybody to tell us that we are nothing but the best? You are some of the most beautiful, intelligent, sophisticated, highly adaptable, and totally indestructible people I know. So the future of Africa is bright because of you. And we are counting on you. And if you don't get it right, guess what? Africa is doomed. We have a responsibility to all of you as your elders, with our wisdom and your intelligence and your energy. Together, we can take our Africa where Africa needs to be. Its rightful place. Its rightful place on the world stage. Those of you who live in the diaspora, you have no excuse. You don't live with the daily reminders of the borders that were created for us. You are an African first and foremost. And the divisions that are keeping us from moving forward, they must be destroyed. It's a mind thing. We're the only ethnic group that does not believe in each other. You look at the diaspora right here in the United States. Ask for the Indian voices, they're loud and clear. Ask for the Irish voices, loud and clear. Chinese, Mexicans, Jews, they stick together like super glue when it comes to issues pertaining to their ethnicity. But it is only us, black people. We are too busy running away from who we are. Why is that? Because Berlin Conference is alive and well. So we are here today to say we understand our history. We understand the journey we have been on. But that we are going to be the generation that's going to turn the corner and make a decision that our Africa can no longer be exploited, that our Africa can now no longer be branded as a diseased and dying continent. I am looking at all of you, and you are looking at me. Do I look diseased and dying? So why are you meant to accept that? Don't ever find yourself engaging in a conversation with anyone that is putting your Africa down. Nobody is perfect. Africa is like a family. You got your schizophrenic aunt, your alcoholic mother, your schizophrenic and menopausal sister, and don't forget the alcoholic uncle. But do you know what? We don't disown them. We work with them. So I know you get hit a lot with, oh, the African leaders, oh, corruption. Well, guess what? We also have some very good African leaders that are doing well by their people. Let's talk about them too. So we want you young people to understand your Africa. Keep it simple, keep it real, know your issues, and make sure before you run around toy-toying, whose war are you fighting? Is it your war, or is it somebody else's war? And we're counting on you young people. The relationships that are going to be created out of here today are relationships that should move Africa to the next level. Let not this be another meeting till we meet again. We want results. We have an amazing Africa Bureau that has allowed us this opportunity to come together, to bring the brothers, the diaspora here in the United States, to mingle with their brothers and sisters on the continent, to chart the way forward. You see, when you come together in a meaningful way, you also give us an opportunity to give us our little 2 cents worth of advice wherever we can, 2 cents worth of help wherever we can. But that can only happen when you guys are having a meaningful conversation. Let me keep it real simple, because the tendency for you young people, when you talk about investment, I had a young man send me an email yesterday. He had a plan, and combined he needed $1 million for this, and $1 billion for this, and $500,000 for that. So to start his project, he needed $1.5 billion. I'm like, son, if you can get that kind of money, you don't need to start a business. We got to be practical. Keep it simple, keep it real. I'm going to share with you before I get off the stage. My girlfriend, who was a seamstress in Ghana, she used to travel here 4 times a year with bags full of dresses, and she had her clients selling. And then AGOA came. And she was introduced to an American guy who had contacts with textiles. To make a long story short, she borrowed $10,000 from the bank. Today, she has a factory and employs 1,500 workers. In the next year, she's looking to double her workforce to 3,000 workers. She is exporting to the US 2 40-foot containers of polo shirts a week, and she cannot meet the demand. That is the kind of thinking I'm expecting to come out of you. You got to crawl before you can walk. I like shea butter, for example. I'm buying shea butter from Whole Foods. Sometimes I find it occasionally at Walmart. But the bulk of it, it's not us who are bringing shea butter here. That is a uniquely black woman product. Why aren't we bringing it here? Why can't we come together and get it done? Because divide and conquer says, don't trust your brother, don't trust your sister, don't even trust yourself. It's that bad. I joke with my white friends. I say, sometimes I just want to be a little fly on the wall when you all talk about us black people and the dumb things that we do. Because we do. I mean, facts and opportunities would be staring us up in the face, but we're looking for somebody up here to give us money. That mentality of getting somebody to give us something, that has to go. We don't need anybody. We don't need anybody to give us anything because we have it within ourselves. There are 55 million black people in this country alone. Let's take 10 million. If 10 million would give $10 a month, that's $1.2 billion in 1 year. But what is keeping us from doing that? Because Berlin Conference is alive and well. Well, guess what, young people? Berlin Conference must die. The rule of divide and conquer must die. And the conversation that needs to happen between us and the image in the mirror must also begin. And today It is the beginning of that conversation. May we begin the conversations that need to be had, and may we also find the right answers that we must give to ourselves. May the conversation begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chihombori Kwao, for those very thought-provoking, encouraging, and inspirational words. You all agree with me that we're all motivated to get started, right? Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Let's give her another big round of applause. And I'm very proud to say that's my boss. So can you imagine what I get every day? I'm very empowered every single day. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We appreciate your remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to welcome Her Excellency, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the United States Mission to the African Union, Jessica Davis-Barr, to address us.
Good morning. Ambassador Chihombori Kwao, you know, as they say, preach, sister, preach, sister. When you think about the United States-AU relationship, you'll see a little bit of a distinct difference between the AU and African style and the traditional United States government style, of course. But this partnership, as exemplified by the history that Ambassador Chihombori so inspiringly has shared with us this morning, really demonstrates how far we have come and how far we still need to go. Distinguished guests and members of the African diaspora, and of course, most importantly, our future, the future that my sister spoke of so eloquently, the Mandela Washington Fellows. It is such an honor to join in the chorus of welcoming you, to congratulate you for all that you've achieved thus far, and to really note that we are here to support you on your mission. It's my distinct honor to welcome you here today and to share the perspectives about why the African Diaspora Young Leaders Summit is such an incredibly special event. We are all thrilled to be here in this space, young people and not so young people anymore, I guess, alike. This is a crucial moment in time when Africa and the African diaspora are forging important new partnerships to chart a new path forward. The United States shares the African Union's mission to support an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Gathered here today are over 100 of Africa's brightest young leaders, together with 100 representatives of the African diaspora, including entrepreneurs, civil society, journalists, athletes, and entertainers. The work that you do every day, whether on the continent or here in the United States, supports the African Union's vision. It's our common vision. One of the highlights of this event is the opportunity to meet and to interact with you. I've already gotten the opportunity to meet many of you this morning, and absolutely inspiring people, inspiring stories. You are leaders who have already distinguished yourselves. Your drive, your talent, and dedication to a brighter future for Africa is inspiring. And this summit is a testament that together we can obtain and create the Africa that we want. This summit provides a much-needed platform for young leaders to showcase achievements and foster effective partnerships in areas of business and entrepreneurship, social advocacy, international development, and culture and entertainment. But today is only the beginning. As Ambassador Chihombori notes, there is so much more to do, and we leave it in your hands to make this progress moving forward. We leave it to you to take advantage of this unique and powerful opportunity that we have today to forge a Pan-African vision that empowers youth, advances human rights, and promotes economic development and good governance in ways that will be far-reaching. Simply put, today's summit has the potential to shape U.S.-Africa policy and ultimately to strengthen the U.S.-Africa partnership. Nelson Mandela, the namesake of the Mandela Washington Fellowship, who would have turned 100 this July. And people from around the world continue to take stock of Madiba's life and what the anti-apartheid icon and Nobel Peace Prize winner means to them. In you, Mandela's fighting spirit lives on. I remain profoundly inspired by Madiba's commitment to building bridges across great divides. Rather than seek revenge or to exploit the deep-seated rancor and anger at injustices long suffered, Mandela chose instead to focus on ways to build consensus, to advance a common and peaceful vision. This spirit is one that we all need more of today. So today is a day to build bridges, just like Mandela did. And while the road that each of you took to get here varies greatly, we are all united in our commitment to the progress and empowerment of Africa and the African diaspora and its communities worldwide. After the summit, you will return home empowered with new skills, new connections, and a renewed passion to transform Africa. My greatest hope for each of you is that you seize the opportunity offered here today to support a peaceful and prosperous Africa in your own unique and impactful way. And please, let us know how we can help you and support you on your journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much there. That important message from Ambassador Jessica Davis-Barr, and she's the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission to the African Union.
Lower the challenges that lie ahead. Africa has seen a decline in the number of authoritarian leaders since 2010. Multiple countries witnessed significant political changes due to popular uprisings, but the number of democracies has not noticeably increased. My colleague Paul Ndiho has more on the story.
The Africa Center for Strategic Studies says a large number of African governments are in a democratizing stage and still have a long way to go. It's a new era in Sudan. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is the new chairman of Sudan's newly formed Sovereign Council. 9 other members were also sworn in at the presidential palace in Khartoum. The Sovereign Council was the result of tense negotiations between the country's pro-democracy leaders of mass protests, which erupted last December against the 3-decade rule of former President Omar al-Bashir and the generals who ousted him in April. Political analysts say Western-style liberal democracy is being tested, especially in countries where some of the world's longest-serving leaders continue to hold power. President Theodore Obiang Nguema Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea has ruled for 40 years since August 1979. In Cameroon, 85-year-old President Paul Biya extended his 36-year rule In 2008, the Cameroonian parliament voted to change the constitution to remove term limits so President Biya would be eligible to extend his time in office. Incumbent President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda is still going strong. In December 2017, Uganda's parliament voted to lift the age limit for the presidency, setting the stage for Yoweri Museveni to rule indefinitely. Museveni pushed to change the constitution in 2005 to abolish the presidential term limits. Idris Deby has ruled Chad for 28 years. He won a fifth term in 2016, and without term limits, he could keep running until he dies. In Congo-Brazzaville, Denis Sassou Nguesso repealed term limits in 2015 and was re-elected on March 2016 for another 7-year term. In 2017, Rwandan President Paul Kagame won with nearly 100% of the vote, securing a third term in office. Kagame's re-election followed a constitutional amendment which ended a 2-term limit, allowing him to remain in power until 2034. Across in Burundi, Pierre Nkurunziza is also widely expected to take advantage of the recent changes to the constitution that would ideally allow him to stay in office until 2034. Perhaps more importantly, not all of Africa is dealing with the lack of democracy syndrome. Other countries are building stronger governance and leadership institutions. Ethiopia is rebranding and building stronger institutions. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has embarked on a series of reforms. Elsewhere, tens of millions of Africans are using the ballot box to deepen the quality of democratic governance and bring about political transitions. On January 24, 2019, Felix Tshisekedi was sworn in as the Democratic Republic of Congo's president, marking the country's first ever peaceful handover of power after multiple bitterly disputed elections. In Senegal, President Macky Sall easily won re-election. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari easily won re-election in 2019. New South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is vowing to create jobs and to tackle deep-rooted corruption. Malawian President Peter Arthur Mutharika was sworn in for a second term after a contentious election marred by allegations of fraud and vote rigging. Finally, Liberian President George Weah and the President of Sierra Leone, Julius Maada Bio, were both democratically elected through an open and transparent process. Paul Diho, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Joining me today are two distinguished guests. Kenneth Mwenda, a former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and Professor of Law at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and in New York. We are joined by Cyril Obi, a Nigerian political scientist who is Program Director of the Africa Initiatives at the Social Science Research Council in New York. I have to say, Dr. Mwenda and Dr. Obi, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
You're most welcome, Shaka. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. And for you, Obi, of course, this is the first time you are appearing on Straight Talk Africa. You are most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Let me begin immediately with you, Dr. Mwenda. What is democracy? Democracy apparently comes from a Greek language. It's a Greek term meaning rule of the simple people.
Correct. There are many definitions of democracy, and there are various types of democracies. For example, you could have a constitutional democracy like what you have in South Africa, or you can have what we call participatory democracy, where the people are involved in indirectly getting to influence decisions. There's also direct democracy, where the people actually directly involved in decision making. So there are various strands of democracy, but the key thing about democracy is there are certain tenets which are really fundamentally universal.
Fundamentally universal.
Yes, for example, due process of the law, which comes from and is inspired by the Magna Carta in the United Kingdom.
The Magna Carta?
Yes. You have
that is the Great Charter.
The Great Charter, exactly.
What does that mean, really?
The Magna Carta was an agreement which was signed in 1215 by King John in England. And he was instigated to do so by the barons of England, in particular the noble women and men and the lords in England, were agitated by the fact that he was constantly taking decisions which would offend the law and customs and traditions in the UK. So they said, look, the excesses of this, what we call an absolute monarchy, were too much.
But it was meant really to benefit the elite.
Exactly, that's why I said the barons.
Not the simple people.
Initially, exactly. But later on, if you look at the Magna Carta, it has inspired almost, I would say, a large number of constitutions in the English-speaking world, including European countries and the US. They've all been inspired by the Magna Carta. When you talk of human rights, the first evidence of sort of documented human rights evidence comes from the Magna Carta in the English-speaking world. So a lot of African countries, today we're discussing Africa, and we have a lot of English-speaking African countries that have been inspired by the Magna Carta. So it forms the bedrock of tenets of democracy. Now within democracy, you will have other things like, the right to education. Okay, these are things which in the past were not heavily, because if you look at democracy, there are various schools of thought. The neoliberal school of thought of democracy, which the leftists will call bourgeois democracy, is basically to say that the politicians are there to serve the interest of the ruling class. So that's a version of democracy.
Right.
But underlying that is the concept of human rights, governance, and transparency. And that's why today we're also talking of things like open government. The people need to have access to data to be able to hold the government accountable. This issue of security and secrecy arguments is no longer holding. We are moving into a new era of transparency at a global stage.
Very interesting. What about you, Dr. Obi? Do you agree with Dr. Kenneth Mwenda?
Yes, I do, largely. I think the whole issue that could be added is to speak to the spirit of democracy. That democracy is designed to protect people against tyranny and to give them a voice and sovereignty in terms of being the ones who decide, who have a freedom, a free right to choose who rules them. And there are some world in their various countries are represented through the vote. So therefore, elections are a critical aspect of democracy as a system of representative government for the people, by the people. And it is a government that is ideally accountable to the people that elect it. And the inbuilt mechanisms against tyranny mean that there is always a periodic renewal of the mandate freely given by the people to ensure accountability, to ensure transparency, to ensure that rights are protected, to also ensure that there is the ability of the people to change leaders if the leaders are not reflecting their interests or taking into consideration their basic or fundamental human rights. So I would say that that really is that the spirit of democracy is one which is founded upon the principle of freedom, freedom of choice, protection by law of property rights, and freedom of people to hold diverse opinions without unnecessarily being subjected to abuse or any violation of their rights. So that would be democracy. The other dimension of democracy is that it is often expressed through political institutions and the principles of the separation of powers, whereby ideally there will be three arms of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, which are designed to balance out each other. However, in practice, the ideal may not always be the norm, but it still coheres with the principle that a political system is protected against tyranny, so that it's not the rule of one or the few, but actually, ideally, the rule of all.
You mentioned, among other things, that democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is pretty much also what a former great American president, Abraham Lincoln, actually once said. And that seems to tally with what the term democracy means in Greek, which is a government of the simple people. But what about others who actually say that what we are seeing in African democracies in practice, not all of them, some of the countries, is what they characterize as a government of some people, by some people, for some people. How do you react to that?
Oh, thank you very much. I would say that there are various strands, as my colleague earlier mentioned. But more fundamentally is the fact that democracy is a continuous process. It's a work in progress. And so there is really no end point, so to speak. And so all countries of the world are on a journey. But admittedly, some are far further ahead of others in this transition from authoritarian forms of government to open and democratic forms of government. But there are three perspectives to what is happening to democracy in Africa. But before I go into this, I'll tell you that democracy in the world is currently in retreat, and this is exemplified by the Freedom House's latest report titled Democracy in Retreat. And so Africa, as a part of the world, seems to be not immune from the challenges that democracy is facing across the world. That's the first point. Now, secondly, I would say that there are various perspectives. Some people feel, and I think rightly so, that the quality of democracy in Africa is declining. They point to corruption, they point to political violence, they point to the ways incumbents in office or in power are able to manipulate political institutions, electoral institutions, security institutions to perpetrate themselves in power, or what some people called third termism. And they are really very worried that democracy in Africa is in a major crisis and may return Africa to a past where there was military rule or where you had a lot of chaos. That's one school of thought. There is another school of thought that says, on the balance, that what we have is mixed. There are some African countries that are actually stable and have held elections and have actually changed governments peacefully using the instrument of elections. And they also point to organizations like the African Union and other regional economic communities who have insisted that having a democratic regime is a condition for being a member of those organizations. And whenever people seize power unconstitutionally, they have automatically suspended them. This is of very serious symbolic value. Thirdly, are those who say, yes, there is a crisis, a political crisis. There is a crisis of democracy. But let's look beneath this crisis and begin to see opportunities for democratic openings. when you look at the role of young people and social movements in countries like Senegal, in countries like Burkina Faso, the current uprisings in Algeria, the protests in Sudan, you begin to see some alternative opening that is being generated on the continent. And Africa is actually unique in several ways, in the sense that you have this paradoxical situation where some people are expressing a kind of despair that democracy is going under. And yet, you also have those people who are observing that in spite of this cloudy picture, there are sparks of hope coming up from time to time that show that there is an alternative that is possible, and that alternative is actually led and expressed by the majority of the people. And I'm happy that you made the point about the role of social media, the whole question of the data, and you can see that we are beginning to see a situation whereby young people, social movements from one country to the other are able to express their will, even if this is not translated into elections and political power. But there is something going on in Africa that the world must pay close attention to. And lastly, is that democracy does not take place in a vacuum. There is a socio-cultural context, there is the economic context, but more fundamentally, there is a global context. And within the global context, Africa has to thrive. And we need to pay attention to that global context very carefully. There are changes taking place in the world. What signals are these changes sending to the various democratic forces which are struggling within the continent? And I think I'll stop here for the moment.
Thank you. Dr. Mwenda, yes. We again go back to the term democracy.
Correct.
Which is defined in the Greek language as the rule of the simple people. You hear often African leaders, some might call them rulers, talk about how power in fact belongs to the people. Right. But at the end of the day, who are these people?
Great question, Shaka. You're absolutely right. Definitions of democracy, like I stated, they're varied, but the common one is, democracy is the rule of the people, for the people, and by the people, and that was by a former American president. That's been widely cited. And then, as you rightly said, the word democracy is is borrowed from Greek language. There are actually two words which form democracy as one. But the question of who are the people, when our leaders say, the people chose me, the people said I should proceed, it's really a reflection of interest of the elites, the aristocrats, so to speak, so oligarchs in the Eastern European context.
In some ways, really, just like the founding of the Magna Carta.
Right. Indeed, and that is why, if you recall earlier on, I pointed out that there's what we call neoliberal democracy or bourgeois democracy, where politicians represent interests of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. So that's a leftist sort of Marxist approach to the concept of democracy. But by and large, what is very important, I pointed out issues of due process of the law, the rule of law. Those are some of the tenets of democracy that wherever you go in the world, you cannot dispute. That you need to have the rule of law, you need to have transparency, you need to have due process of the law. Right. And those concepts come from the Magna Carta. That's the bedrock of democracy.
Those are universal values as far as democracy is concerned. Yes. Now, when we talk about the Magna Carta, it was obviously established in what we know as the United Kingdom.
Correct.
What about the fact that this United Kingdom we talk about democracy, talk about constitutionalism, actually happens to have the distinction of probably being the only country that I know of which does not have a written constitution?
The British system, the English system, follows what we call parliamentary supremacy. So parliament is supreme, whereas the US, for example, the constitution is supreme. So an act of parliament in the UK is supreme, cannot be challenged. However, because of accession to EU, You have now legal jurisprudence that's coming from the EU courts, for example, which now supersede decisions of British courts, because that's at a regional level. And there's a body of human rights coming into the European Human Rights Court. So we have to take cognizance of that fact. And there are a lot of customs and traditions which have been built in the systems through decisions of the House of Lords and in enactments of Parliament. So the British system really, like I said, the Westminster model follows what we call parliamentary supremacy. Much of what we have in Commonwealth Africa is a blend of the Westminster model and the American system. In the UK, the Prime Minister is the head of government. That's what we had in Zimbabwe in 1980 when Robert Mugabe became Prime Minister. Kenan Banana was president.
Because there's a parliamentary system.
Exactly. But along the way, Zimbabwe shifted to a presidential system of government like Zambia and the rest of them,
and
Malawi.
merged the two.
Exactly.
The Prime Minister and President.
So you have a blend of two traditions here. And in addition to that, you also have indigenous traditions of the Africans themselves, which then creates some sort of mixed culture of traditions within the constitutional jurisprudence of these countries.
So an African president almost really becomes an emperor?
I wouldn't say so.
Who checks him?
Yeah, the challenge that we have is having strong institutions to provide checks and balances.
But we don't have those strong
for
institutions
example,
so far in most of the African countries.
Yes, I'll give a typical example. In the US, for example, the president can appoint a judge to the Supreme Court. He has that constitutional right to do so. In Africa, presidents in some countries, yes, the constitution allows them to appoint judges, but the question
is... the U.S. president will not appoint, will nominate.
Right, nominate. Yes.
And then the Senate.
The Senate will, yes.
Yes.
But what we have similar traditions in most of African countries. But the challenge that we have here, there are not effective checks and balances which will still protect the judiciary, even though the nomination came from the president.
You talk about the British democratic system, which of course is a reflection of the parliamentary system.
Correct.
But what about the fact that when you look at what is happening because of Brexit, for example, earlier today,
right,
the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, essentially asked the Queen in her capacity as head of state to suspend Parliament. Is that a democracy?
Well, the British system, like I said, the Queen is a titular head. She's a nominal figure in the UK. So the executive powers rest at downtown, 10 Downing.
But she's the head of state.
But she's a title, a nominal head of state.
The government, in fact, is called Her Majesty's government.
Yeah, including all territories and protectorates that were under the British. She was titular head of state before we got independence. So that's the tradition there. But I think we have to look at what the constitutional rights of the Prime Minister are in England, whether he can make such a proposal to the Queen. The Queen merely assents to the executive decisions of the executive, then the Queen will assent. The Queen herself does not exercise executive powers. She doesn't.
Right.
We must make that very clear.
Right.
The Queen does not exercise executive powers. It's the Prime Minister. So he can merely recommend for a nominal or sort of ceremonial gesture to assent.
But the Queen, in fact, appoints the Prime Minister.
It's tradition, yes. That's the tradition. That's the tradition. And that's what we had in Zimbabwe when Mugabe became Prime Minister. Kenan Banana was president.
Correct.
Until Zimbabwe reversed the process.
But was a ceremonial president.
Was exactly like the Queen, was a ceremonial president.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Let me come to you, Dr. Obi. Earlier, you talked about the importance of checks and balances. You talked about the three branches of government in order for democracy to really work very well. What about the fact that those three types of branches are very much present in most African countries, but that in most African countries, in practice, it is the executive, actually, which controls both the judiciary and the legislature?
Thank you very much. I would say something about the Magna Carta and then go into the question you just asked. I think that the whole point of having strong institutions, strong and effective institutions, is a very good point. However, I would say that to realize the kind of ideals that the Magna Carta stood for, note that the Magna Carta was really between a king and rebel barons. You need to have citizens. So African simple people, or the African masses, need to be full citizens with full citizenship rights. Citizens are able to claim rights, particularly political rights. But people who do not have citizenship rights are marginalized and put at a disadvantage in claiming such rights. There are various reasons why people may not be able to claim their citizenship rights, ranging from issues of history, issues of minority identities of different kinds, issues of poverty, and so people are more interested in the day-to-day existence and are not really looking, are not really too much involved in voting. And sometimes some people have even gone to the extent of saying that apathy is a result of people not seeing any real choices between the leading candidates in elections, or what a particular a particular African economist calls choiceless democracies, democracies that really offer no choice. Back to your point about the separation of powers, that is the idea. For democracies to really function, the separation of powers is the ideal. However, in some countries, depending on the kind of political system they operate, be it parliamentary or be it presidential, it does have implications for the power that the executive wields, particularly if the executive has control over economic power. It can leverage economic power to a great extent in its relationship with the other arms. The other issue has to do with loyalty to the political party. When a party is in majority and members are in parliament and as well as in the executive and constitute the majority in parliament, party loyalty counts for something. Thirdly, when citizens are in such a position that they are not able to participate in actual decision making, but only stop short of participation during elections, then you see a situation in which impunity begins to creep in terms of the executive accumulating so much power at the expense of the other arms. However, I would say that rather than see this as a problem, the challenge is to see how the other arms can be empowered. And it takes an alert and committed citizenry to be able to insist on certain standards that the other arms of government should actually play their role. So you are right to the extent that some countries do suffer from this, but it's not an irreversible situation. It's a situation that can be reversed. And lastly, history is also very important. A lot of us tend to forget the history of some of our countries, that these are democracies that not too long ago existed in countries that were either authoritarian one-party states or military states. And there is a legacy, there's a political legacy coming out of this. Indeed, some of the military governments and the authoritarian governments actually were able to influence the succession or the transition process, whether it's from military to civilians or whether it was from a single party to a multi-party state. In fact, in some cases, the people who came to lead the new multi-party systems, the members of the opposition who won elections and became the new presidents or the new prime ministers, were actually members of the old one-party states. And as you can imagine, sometimes political habits die hard. And some of this has survived into the current system. So what I would say is that we will need an effective citizenry, a vigilant citizenry, to begin to make to begin to push for some of the reforms that will actually recalibrate the system to ensure the kind of balancing that we need.
A very good point there. Unfortunately, time happens not to be our best ally. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa, and we'll have more of a discussion in a moment. So please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about,
sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them, today, not tomorrow. So let's connect, let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Up Front every Wednesday, 1730 UTC, right here on the Voice of America.
We appreciate all of the audience feedback, and Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. You can watch our show and leave a comment. Now let's look at what's on tap for next week's program.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, education has the power to transform the lives of people worldwide, especially in Africa. But often, educational practices are outdated and not student-centered. Rethinking education on the next Straight Talk Africa.
And today we are discussing the process of democracy on the continent. Our guests are Dr. Kenneth Mwenda and Dr. Cyril Obi. Well, I have to say again, Dr. Kenneth Mwenda and Dr. Cyril Obi, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to be able to host you on Straight Talk Africa today.
You're most welcome, Shaka.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, Obi. Dr. Obi, the last time he talked, he left on a very interesting point. The point of the need for citizenship participation in order for you to ensure that you do indeed have a democracy. Now, when you talk about citizenship, first of all, you have to have a population that happens to be socially and politically conscious, happens to be conscious, aware of its rights. And the only way they can do that is to become beneficiaries of some kind of civic education. Because when you talk about citizenship, you're talking about people who owe allegiance to the state and therefore have constitutional rights, have inalienable rights. You could even say birthrights for that matter. They are the primary stakeholders really in this business. But for the most part, it seems to me that when you go across the continent, most of the countries, Africans are not citizens, they are subjects. Because a subject owes allegiance to an individual authority, does not also have constitutional rights, except in fact may expect privileges from that particular individual authority who happens to be in power. It could be a presidential monarch, it could be in fact a monarch or an emperor for that matter. So when you talk about most countries in Africa, are Africans citizens or are they in fact subjects?
Good question, Shaka. First of all, yes, let me pick up where my colleague Cyril left over. The concept of citizenship, both in political science and in constitutional law, does not sort of exist in the abstract. It has to be tied into civic education. It's very, very important. The consciousness enlightenment of the masses. Now, when we talk of civic education, you look at the state of our economies. On the one hand, we have what we call political democracy, and there's also the issue of economic democracy. We have done well with liberalizing markets as part of the move from a one-party state into multi-party politics. But that is not an end itself. It's a means to democracy. And therefore, we need to move forward now to start building institutions.
Who controls the path?
Exactly. And when you talk of civic education, it starts in most of these developed countries. The Constitution is taught in elementary, primary school, high school.
It is part of socialization.
It's part of socialization. And even the jurisprudence of human rights. You know, there's what we call the first generation of human rights and the second generation of human rights.
Yes.
Now, let me not become too...
Citizens, in fact, become the frontline troops.
Exactly.
In terms of defending their rights, defending their country.
Yeah, so the second...
Not the army, not the police.
Exactly. So what you find in the Constitution, is the first generation of human rights, the Bill of Rights. Then you have these other human rights we call the second generation, social, economic, cultural rights. Okay. Now, these are pretty hard even to enforce, but they are within the bedrock of democracy. And that's why we spoke about the concept of open government. The citizens need to have access to data to hold their elected officials accountable.
They need to know what their rights are in order to assert them.
Exactly. These things shouldn't be a myth. You know, so there's an element of transparency, due process of the law, rule of law. You don't have laws which are retroactive or target individuals. That sort of, even the way you enact constitutions or amend constitutions, you know, there has to be due process of the law. And when we say due process of the law, we are not just saying legality. No, there's a difference between legitimacy and legality. You can have somebody doing things in accordance with the law, but the intent with which the procedure is used to achieve an end it does not indicate bona fide intent whatsoever.
And what about the role of the police, for example? Because one finds that in most African countries, you actually have a police force which is pretty much similar to what used to happen under colonialism. And yet, the police should be a service to the people, protecting the people. But in this particular case, the police plays a partisan role, protecting those in power.
You know, speaking as a lawyer, indeed, you're absolutely right, Shaka. I agree with you. But if I take off my lawyer hat and speak as a political scientist, state machinery, the police are part of state machinery together with the army. Okay, that's how the state actually holds on control and obtains legitimacy. There are basically two ways in which the state will control and gain legitimacy. One, through use of force. Coercion. The other one is through articulating an ideology around which they can galvanize support. Okay, and that's where you get a lot of propaganda. And so forth, you know, to give yourself legitimacy. So most of these governments, that's what we are saying. So the police force, legally speaking, yes, they're supposed to be a service, but there's also the political reality. You know, who appoints the Inspector General of the Police, you know who does, the tenure of office, who fires him, all those things. So you find that these guys are not very independent. Their tenure is somewhat, not secure. So,
but then the question actually becomes is, who is in charge of a country? Who is the primary stakeholders really in a country? Is it the people or is it the guys who are in power, controlling the state?
Under Montesquieu's theory of the doctrine of separation of powers, like Cyril pointed out, there are three things. You have the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. But I must point out something. The doctrine of separation of powers is not an absolute doctrine. It's a relative doctrine. So there are checks and balances, and sometimes there are overlaps, even here in the US. For example, you may find that the president nominates somebody who's going to be a judge in the judiciary. One would say, why is the executive encroaching in activities of the judiciary? Why don't we have a judicial service commission to appoint a judge? So those type of arguments. Right now in Zambia, for example, I don't want to go into details because there's a case before the Constitutional Court where Parliament has said, despite the fact that the Law Association of Zambia has taken to the Constitutional Court a petition to throw out the proposed bill, Bill number 10, to amend the Constitution, Parliament has said it will proceed because there's a concept that Parliament is sovereign and by itself. So how do you reconcile? And indeed, Parliament has a lot of immunity, including immunity against defamation. Whatever is said in Parliament, you cannot sue a parliamentarian. They enjoy those common law immunities. So how do you deal with those type of situations? It's not an encroachment on the powers of the judiciary, but again, I don't want to preempt these cases because you can be cited for contempt of court. There's a doctrine of sub judice. So I'll just leave it there.
Very interesting. And after all, you also happen, some say, to be a beneficiary of the highest honor of the Republic of Zambia bestowed upon you by President Lunga, the head of state. By the way, congratulations on that.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I'm eternally grateful to His Excellency the President, Dr. Edgar Chagwa Lungu, for the honor that he bestowed on me as because presidential insignia of meritorious achievement.
Yeah.
That's the award that I received.
But why is it that there are some people who are a little bit concerned about that? Dr. Kenneth Mwenda being associated with the President of the Republic?
Well, first and foremost, we are both lawyers, number one, and we are both advocates of the High Court of Zambia, meaning to say I am under oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the Republic of Zambia. And in all my activities, I'm an officer of the court. Even though I'm based in Washington, I'm still an officer of the High Court.
You mean in Zambia the Constitution cannot be amended so as to remove term limits and age caps?
There is a procedure. There is a procedure. It can be amended. There is a procedure which is spelled out in the Constitution. But like I say, these are discussions which are now before the Constitutional Court, so we cannot sort of delve into details.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Let me come to you, Dr. Obi. He talked about things to do with propaganda in as far as the state control is concerned. And there happens to be a question from the Republic of Ghana, from Darafu Paul, who says that the challenges for democracy in Africa are the abuse of power and what he calls an overdose of freedom of speech and the manipulation of the media. How do you react to that?
Well, that's a legitimate view to hold. But it's very difficult to pin down the challenge of democracy to a few things. It's, as I said at the beginning, democracy is work in progress. The point about citizenship, as my colleague mentioned, is a very important one. People need to be conscious and they need to be aware. And they need to see themselves as being part and parcel of the state to which they belong to, because that state protects them, it takes care of their fundamental human needs and welfare, and it guarantees them a future and also for their children a future. Part of the crisis we have is that increasingly the distance between the people and the state is widening. And this is because we also need to pay attention to the economic dimensions of democracy. What we do not really pay attention to most of the time is that the history of democracy had an economic component. And because of the way democracy came to Africa, historically after colonialism, Africa could not replicate the same conditions for the kind of democracy that we had in Europe, North America, and places like Australia. So that economic gap is also there. And so when we talk about the challenges and the question of the freedom of speech, yet the freedom of speech sometimes is abused, and that is why we have institutions. It is the responsibility of institutions to take care of those that tend to abuse the freedom of speech. And I'm sure my colleague understands and he appreciates that institutions exist to play a role. But there is a challenge in Africa. The whole question of the gap between the very rich and the very poor is something that has implications for the ability of people to even begin to ask for their rights. They want bread. And if you look at how the protests in Sudan started, it was all about bread. And if you look at the protests of the 1990s that eventually led to a wave of democracies across Africa, it was all about bread. So democracy in Africa needs to have a human face. It needs to have a people's face. People need to eat. People need to know that when they come out of school, they will get a job that can cover their basic needs. People want to see a future for their children that is better for them.
Wait a minute, Obi. Aren't you likely to fall into the trap of some undemocratic African leaders, some would in fact prefer to call them rulers, who sometimes say to their people, ask them questions whether in fact they can eat democracy, that what they need is service delivery, as if in fact the two, democracy and service delivery, were mutually exclusive rather than being mutually perhaps reinforcing.
Yes, I like you for bringing me back to reality. Thank you. Yes, your point is very valid. Mm-hmm. Your point is very valid, but that's not the sense in which I'm taking democracy to be. I mean, democracy is about freedom. Fundamentally, it's about freedom. What we see a lot of the time is that people focus on the political aspect of democracy. There is an economic aspect of the freedom that democracy should uphold. And my point simply is that political and economic freedom and justice need to come together for you to actually enjoy the fruits of democracy. It's like, I will give you the example of a bird. A bird flies with two wings. It cannot fly with one wing. The democracy bird cannot fly on the political wing alone. There has to be an economic wing, and that economic wing needs to have a social face.
You bring policies. You have to come up with the policies that create jobs.
Yes, and that's the economic freedom I'm talking about. You need to come with policies that create jobs, but you need to be able to control your economy to be able to create those jobs. Part of the challenge we have is that some African countries rely on one export commodity. And that export commodity, the prices fluctuate from year to year. The other thing, of course, is economic management, how governments manage the economy, which goes back to the question of accountability, which goes back to democracy once again. So you begin to see how the economic and the political are actually interlinked and integrated, and it's very difficult to separate them. So my point is this, that in paying attention to the political, economic participation, economic justice are very fundamental for people to evolve fully as citizens, because citizenship is the bedrock of democracy. In our time and at the level of economic development that we have found ourselves, we cannot afford to build a democracy on abstractions. It has to be a democracy that people can feel, that they can sense, that they can relate to, and that relates to their quality of life.
Very interesting. Dr. Mwenda, Dr. Obi, I think, makes a very good point. But what about the fact that when politicians are running for office, someone said that, in fact, they do it in poetry. They promise, for example, heaven on earth. But when they are elected or when they rig themselves into office and begin the business of governing or ruling, that one, it is said, they do it in prose.
Good question, Shaka. It's not unusual for Africa. you know, this thing happens globally.
I said politicians.
Yes, it's not unusual. It's not peculiar to Africa.
Correct.
We see this even in the Western world.
But at least in the Western world, at least leaders are held accountable.
But not entirely.
By the citizens or the media.
We just don't want to mention names, but you know things they say during campaigns, and to what extent those promises are fulfilled.
That is very true, but at least for them, they have the luxury of having strong institutions.
Correct.
And also being societies, in fact, that are governed by laws.
Correct. In fact, I
wanted not by men or women.
Related to that, I wanted to pick up on a point my colleague Cyril made on the issue of justice. There are two strands of justice, what we call distributive justice and restorative justice. Now, one of them is how people can get benefits from the judicial system in terms of what their rights and entitlements. Restorative justice is correction of wrongs, how we can restore. So that's part of democracy. So when you have a situation...
And that can be done by an independent judiciary.
Precisely. Now, when you have promises being made during election campaigns and so forth, the people, that's why we need civic education. The people need to be aware. Next time we have elections, can we elect such a leader? Okay? There are a lot of unrealistic promises. Sometimes you don't even have to subject them to scrutiny or common sense where this is not attainable. Where somebody tells you in 90 days I'm going to do this, in 90 days I'm going to do that. 90 days, come on, that's 3 months.
What about buying votes? Buying votes with sugar, buying votes with salt, with soap?
Again, it comes back to issue of institutions, anti-corruption agencies that we have to deal with those type of issues. When we're dealing with problem with corruption is that, first of all, corruption in many countries is a predicate offense of money laundering. So you can actually trigger money laundering laws as well. Now, the problem with the issue of corruption is there's very limited political will to fight corruption in Africa.
Why?
From the executive. Because there are a lot of stakeholders. You can run the whole country down.
Because there's corruption, in fact, which helps them to stay in power.
There are a lot of stakeholders.
Based on political patronage.
Especially what we call PEPs, politically exposed persons. These are in strategically positioned situations. That's why you find the opposition constantly making noise and wanting to get into government immediately because the time is running for them to eat as well. So there's a whole mess. There's a lot of pretense that we are pushing democracy whilst their personal interests. So sometimes even the opposition is not inspiring. It's not a question of changing government.
If it is allowed any political space at all.
Yeah, exactly. You can have two evils. You can have those in government are not doing what they're supposed to do. Even those in oppositions, they don't have the right agenda.
But you have situations, my friend, in certain African countries where, yes, on paper, in theory, you are looking at a multi-party sort of dispensation.
Correct.
But in reality, you're looking at multi-partyism essentially operating on a one-party state template.
Yes, what we call...
Where, in fact, there is hardly any difference between the ruling party and the state.
Yes,
the two are fused.
What we call dictatorship of parliament, where you have the ruling party has a majority seats in parliament, and it's very difficult, of course, for the opposition to have a voice.
And the guys in power like to compete every 5 years or 4 years. They say that they hold periodical elections, and they like to compete against people whom they make sure their hands are tied behind their backs.
In fact,
and their feet are tied together.
I would go so far and saying, not only in Africa or Asia or any other developing country, including the Western world, including the US, parliamentarians need to have fixed terms of office, just like a head of state. You can't have somebody who's been a senator forever for life, or a parliamentarian for life. I mean, it doesn't make sense. They have to have 2 terms, 3 terms, they're out, other people come in.
But let's deal with our own situation first, especially the presidents.
Yes.
Why, in fact, when they start, when these people are sworn into office.
Correct.
What do they say when they are holding the Constitution or the Bible?
Or when
or
they're
the
taking
Quran?
off, yes, of course.
When they pledge
there's a pledge, yes,
to protect, to preserve, to defend the Constitution of the Republic.
Exactly.
And the next day, they are the ones, in fact, who are in the front line of making sure that there is this business called the shifting of constitutional political goalposts.
Yeah, I mean,
why does the world, the international community, continue doing business as usual with those type of people? Because frankly, to me, it seems that you are looking at some kind of coup here, a sort of coup,
right,
without necessarily an AK-47. And yet, we should pay tribute to the international community and the African Union, for example, for making sure that when a soldier wakes up very early, earlier than others, and goes to the nearest radio station and announces that he has taken over for whatever reason, nobody is willing to continue doing business with that person.
Yeah.
Why can't the international community do the same thing? If you change the constitution for personal or political gain, we are not going to do business with you. If you hold an election whose results do not reflect the will of the people, we are not going to do business with you.
Thank you, Shaka. Let me start first of all.
Well, unfortunately, I am told that time is not our best ally.
Great.
Next time. Well, on that note, our distinguished guests are Kenneth Mwenda and in New York, Cyril Obi. Thanks to our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.
Ici, la voix de l'Amérique.
Madame, mademoiselle, monsieur, bonsoir. Nous vous retrouvons avec grand plaisir dans Le Monde aujourd'hui à la une de l'actualité ce mercredi 28 août. Dernières heures de tractation au Soudan pour le nouveau gouvernement, appelé à mettre un terme à la guerre et à relever l'économie du pays. Crainte d'un nouvel exode massif depuis les...
It all began in 2017 when Dark Professional launched its first product called Sensation, a 5-star pain-free cordless trimmer that achieved immediate success. We have since then been working hard to extend our vision, and today we introduce to you 3 new significantly advanced products: Signature, Superior, and Synergy. Be the first to explore our new advanced technological innovations made by us for you, simply by Dot.
Thank you for staying with Africa News. This is your weekly program dedicated to African and international football news. It's Football Planet, and coming up, the 2022 World Cup qualifiers begins. This week, 28 teams are competing for the long marathon to Qatar. On international truce and a pretty busy time for the continent teams. Also, we discuss Sadio Mane's wrath in the Premier League. For the very first time, the Senegalese striker attacked Mohamed Salah, an unusual gesture. You hear what Reds coach Jurgen Klopp has to say about it. And we'll talk the appointment of a new coach. In Liberia, Peter Butler has a mission to qualify the Lone Stars for the next African Cup and the 2022 World Cup with a one-year contract. The administrative manager of Liberia's national coach, Sebastian K. Collins, will tell us more on this program. Hello there and welcome to Football Planet. We begin with an unusual occurrence, the wrath of Sadio Mane against his teammate Mohamed Salah. On Saturday, the Senegalese striker who scored for the second time this season attacked the Egyptian for his individualism. But this ego battle did not disturb their coach Jurgen Klopp, who even laughed it off at a press conference.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, he was upset. That was obvious. Sadio cannot hide his emotions. I like that. But all sorted. We spoke about it. Everything is fine. We are individuals. We are emotional. It was a situation in the game, obviously. What else could happen? It was not a phone call. So was a situation in the game he was not happy about, and that's then completely fine. Yeah, would he do it exactly the same manner again? Probably not, but it happened. So nothing happened. He didn't say any wrong words, or it just looked a little bit different to how he looks usually. For me, of course, I can understand that's a little story. Thank God we are now away for a week, so if you write something about it, we will not read it anyway. And after a week, nobody can remember it anymore, so it's really cool moment to do it. But it's all good, really, all fine.
No doubt, there'll be a bit of explanation between Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah, who'll be able to take advantage of the international truce to get off to a good start. The international truce is precisely what we're talking about, with a very busy calendar on the continent. And we begin with the first round of the 2022 World Cup qualifiers, with first leg matches being played this week. 28 teams are competing. Take a look. The matches will be played next Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, and this is the first test for Liberia's new coach Peter Butler. The British signed a one-year contract with the aim of qualifying for the AFCON 2021 and the World Cup 2022. Joining us from Monrovia is Sebastian K. Collins, manager of the Lone Stars. Sebastian, welcome. First of all, why did you sign a one-year contract with such great objectives?
Well, we gave a one-year contract with the option of renewing after 6 months. So we have two different qualifiers against Sierra Leone, against Chad. Against Sierra Leone in the World Cup qualifier, and against Chad in the AFCON 2021. So we are playing the first week in September 4th. So these two qualifiers, we're going to see how we perform, how people are going to perform with the team. I mean, we don't have to win all the matches, but maybe with good performance, we could renew after 6 months.
The Lone Stars narrowly missed qualifying for the last two editions of the AFCON with local coaches. Do you think the arrival of a stranger could change the situation?
Exactly, because for the two Nation Cup, we used local Liberian coaches, and they almost took us there. Just something we are missing. I mean, we are missing of something, and we believe that with Peter's experience, we can be able to. We can get it right. The last two Nation Cup, as you are aware, we came very close. I mean, we could have qualified, because the previous qualifier, we led to go 2-0, and in the last 10 minutes, they redeemed two, they redeemed us. So we believe that, with Peter coming in, because with Ben Mason, maybe with Mason, there are something with Ben Mason, with the local coaches. So with Peter's own expertise, we believe he can just make that tweak that we can be able to qualify for the next nation, the 2021 African Cup. Because we are winning games home, we are losing away. So if we continue, if we win our games home, we know we can qualify. We just made the last qualifier against Congo. Congo Kinshasa, we led them up to the 84 minutes and everything. The games we are won, we're going to qualify for the Nation Cup. So we believe with Peter and his experience, we will be able to qualify. We are very optimistic.
Optimistic, yes, but isn't the low level of the Liberian National Championship likely to be a setback? And how would you convince expatriates to join the national team?
Well, the local football team in Liberia, they are not too strong, I must admit. But we have good young players. We have good talent. We have talented players in the league. So we just need a good training, good development. So Peter is here for a year. The contract we're getting, he's not going to leave the country and stay here for 6 months and come back. No, he's staying here. Maybe he can leave 1 month. He'll be here. He'll be able to work with the players for a longer period. So we believe he can tap into the local talent and develop them to make them very competitive. Well, we don't have problem bringing our players back home. The players, our international, they always want to represent Liberia. They love Liberia. They love their country. They always want to come and represent Liberia. So we just, they are all happy that we have a new coach. They are all excited for this project. They are willing to come. In fact, we invited, I think, 14 players for this coming game against Sierra Leone. So, we don't have any problem bringing them. We don't have any problem bringing them back home.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and we wish you good luck for the future.
Okay, no problem. You're welcome.
Sebastian K. Collins is the administrative manager of the Liberian national football team. We continue with the international truce since it is not only the preliminaries of the 2022 World Cup. Friendly matches are also on the agenda for these dates. Very beautiful duels are expected, notably between Tunisia and Ivory Coast. Now let's talk about women's football with the qualifying rounds for the 2020 Olympic Games. This week we'll know which teams qualified for the last round, and unless there's a last-minute surprise, all the big names should be in the game. At least if we look at the results of the first leg matches in the second round last week. Only South Africa was held in check by Botswana, as you can see in this result. The second leg matches will be played on Tuesday. Note the qualification of DRC after withdrawal of Equatorial Guinea. Back to men's football to discuss the appointment of Moda Kabaya to the Tunisian bench. The former coach of Esperance of Tunis signed a 3-year contract with the heavy task of performing better than his predecessor, Alain Giresse, semi-finalists of the last AFCON with the Eagles of Carthage. Here's Naya Katoum and Michael Dibi's report.
The newly appointed coach of the Tunisian national football team, Mondel Kebe, had a press conference at the Tunisian Football Federation headquarters in the capital, Tunis. Kebe has been appointed coach of the Tunisian team in replacement of resigned French coach Alain Giresse. I have been dreaming of this day and the ambition of leading the national team for more than 15 years, so I thank God that I have reached this dream. As for the pressure, it has always existed in committees, and we have always faced difficulties. According to a statement issued by the Tunisian Federation, the new coach of the Carthage Eagles has signed a renewable 3-year contract. One of my strong convictions is that the national team can go very far, What distinguishes a national team that has achieved a high level of performance is a lot of desire, cohesion, and in difficult times, a lot of solidarity. And I think as staff, we all work on that. For the Tunisian Football Federation and its president, the choice of Mouder remains the right one in view of the challenges ahead. The technical team had the duty to qualify the team for the next AFCON and the World Cup in Qatar.
Immense challenges facing the new boss of the Eagles of Carthage. You should know that Burkina Faso and Nigeria won the men's and women's tournament of the African Games, respectively. The Stallions beat Nigeria 2-0 to win their first gold medal since the creation of these African Games. As for the Super Falcons, they defeated Cameroon, confirming their first place on the list with 3 gold medals. Let's head to Spain to talk about the La Liga's new sensation, Barcelona's Guinea-Bissau's Assoumani Fati. The young Nugget entered the annals of the Catalan club on Saturday and simply became the youngest striker in history. At 16 and 10 months, he was ahead of Bojan Kikic and Lionel Messi. Meanwhile, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang continues to play the role of saviour for Arsenal in the Premier League. The Gabonese striker helped the Gunners avoid defeat in North London derby against Tottenham. It is the former Borussia Dortmund striker's 3rd goal of the season. And that's it for the show. This program can be found on our website at africanews.com. We'll see you next week for another edition of Football Planet. Have an excellent week and goodbye.
Une excellente semaine en compagnie de nos programmes. Au revoir.